When living in France, how did I respond when I had French people tell me, oh, you don't understand what I'm saying in English because I have an English accent and Americans just don't understand English accents? Let's put a little bit of cultural context in here because in the last video there were some huge misunderstandings around this and being like, well, the French are just uneducated, they don't know how the accent developed. And it's like, no, that's not what's happening here. This happens a lot, especially with like people that are high school level. That is where it most often happened to me when I was an assistant teacher in a high school, and kids would be like, oh, well, you don't understand what I'm saying. It's just because I have an English accent. And I'd have to be like, no, no, no. What happens in schools in a lot of countries is they tell them they have to pick a dialect and an accent and stick to it and not be like saying half their words with American slang and then throwing in some British slang and then trying to, juggle between an American and English and a Scottish accent when they're trying to learn a language. They can listen, of course, to all these different accents, but they really encourage them to just pick one dialect and stick with it, which I think is very solid learning advice. But it has also led to kind of this myth that there's such a huge separation between British English and American English that sometimes the two countries just don't understand each other at all. And I mean, with some vocabulary and some words, that's true, but for the most part, no, we have no problem communicating with English people, right? And how I responded depended on the situation. 2 of the times it was with students of mine that were high school students, and I just set them straight. No, you have a very thick French accent. It's not that I can't understand an English accent, it's that you are mispronouncing the words and saying words that don't even exist in English. You need to make sure you're pronouncing every letter in this word, or at least making sure you're putting a little bit more emphasis on the last syllable, because otherwise no one in any dialect is going to understand what you're saying. And I was helping them prepare for exams, so it was completely appropriate for me to cut to the chase and just be like, nope, your accent is completely difficult to understand and you need to work on that before your end of year oral exam. And then the third case, the person was being a bit condescending, but because of the circumstance, I was not going to set them straight, and I had a lot of empathy. It was a friend of ours who was autistic and who has a very hard time socializing, and is just overall, he has a lot of special needs related to his autism, and communicating is sometimes quite hard for him. And so he was trying to look cool in front of our group of friends and was saying a couple phrases in English where his French accent was so incredibly thick that I thought he was still speaking French and that they were just French words I'd never heard before, because they were completely indecipherable if you were trying to understand them from an English speaking perspective. And so when I asked him in French if he could repeat himself, sorry, I didn't catch that, he was just like, oh, it must be because you're American. Americans, they never understand English accents anyways. And he was clearly trying to save face, and he was clearly very embarrassed that he hadn't been able to communicate in the way he thought he was. So that time I just changed the subject and moved on and was just as happy as normal. So it all depends on the context.